riparian ecosystems. And we want to share some low-tech, process-based in-stream restoration activities that will maybe someday be as commonly utilized as buffer planting is today. So, as we all know and has been reinforced by this morning's presentations, riparian buffers are extremely important for wildlife, fish, and our rivers. There's shading, leaf, and large wood input, overland flow filtration, and so on. And on the flip side, of course, riparian ecosystems need intact, functioning rivers that are well connected to their floodplains. After all, riparian plant species are, by definition, hydrophilic and therefore are benefited by fairly regular flooding. But a problem for our riparian ecosystems across Vermont and around the world is that due to the long histories of human management, a majority of rivers are incised into their valley floors and no longer flood on a regular basis. Here in Vermont, the DEC Rivers program has documented that 75% of assessed river miles are indeed incised. And this is a serious challenge for our riparian ecosystems and our efforts to restore them because, again, incised channels don't flood regularly. The water tables along those channels are lowered as they follow the base elevation of the channel. And the channels themselves tend to be very unstable and tend to erode the floodplains upon which we plant and riparian vegetation grows. So now just really quickly, I want to jump to a quick review of how recent fluvial geomorphic research has changed the scientific understanding of river system form and process and what that means for river restoration. So the field of fluvial geomorphology has long been dominated by the perception that the natural or reference or pre-disturbance condition of rivers in alluvial valleys is the single thread meandering channel. And that hydrology and geology are the preeminent factors driving river processes and shaping river form. And this has led to a very expensive restoration approach that focuses on engineering and excavation to achieve a single thread, quasi-stable river. And beyond being expensive, this restoration approach really isn't accessible to all of us. In a way, it creates a barrier, a sense that only engineers and fluvial geomorphologists with PhDs can engage in river restoration activities. But this understanding of river systems is being challenged by relatively recent research, showing that the multi-thread or the anastomosed channel, in which biologically derived structural elements are a primary driver in maintaining that condition, is the more likely natural or pre-disturbance form. On this slide from a recent presentation by fluvial geomorphologist Brian Kluwer, he listed the most significant studies leading to this understanding. We have studies from Europe, the Eastern United States, California, and the Pacific Northwest. And the crux of all this research, as is stated in the paper by Walter and Merritt done on the East Coast, is basically that before European settlement, our streams were much smaller, consisting of anabranching or multi-thread channels, and they were bordered by extensive vegetated wetlands. This recognition of the anastomosing channel as the dominant pre-disturbance condition was incorporated into a new channel evolution model that is more complex than its predecessor, that was based on the single thread channel as a pre-disturbance condition. And one really important aspect of the paper that introduced this model is the finding that rivers in multi-thread complex condition provide much greater habitat value. So if we think about the wood turtle, bird, and brook trout requirements we heard earlier this morning, much greater habitat value than the simpler single thread channels, largely devoid of structural elements that restorationists have long thought or long identified as the restoration target. So as you might imagine, this new understanding of the pre-disturbance condition, its superior habitat values, and the importance of biological elements have huge implications for river restoration. And for more on the discussion of the importance of biology, I'm now going to hand the screen over to Megan.
Thanks, Shane. So another model that changes our perspective on river restoration is the stream evolution triangle. It was introduced by Janine Castro of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and describes 3 drivers of stream evolution that we need to mimic in our stream restoration: biology, hydrology, and geology. So let's walk through what each of those drivers mean. When a stream is geologically driven, it is highly controlled by the lateral confinement, whether that's naturally through bedrock or through manufactured means like ditching. In these systems, biology and hydrology are still important, but not the strongest drivers of what the channel looks like and acts like. So to get out of the geology corner of the triangle, a system becomes more alluvial and less controlled. Systems that are in hydrology-driven areas are usually due to large volumes of water or in places where the stream has the power to alter the geology and biology. For example, in braided streams that erode malleable soils and change flow patterns. These areas are where hydrology is a driving factor of the stream system. Biology-driven systems can be thought of in many different ways. The deepest of the biology corner has a high presence of wetland obligate vegetation that interacts with the flow regularly and have a high impact on the stream, where more upland vegetation would be modeled closer to the center of the triangle. Other ways to think about the biology-driven system include the presence of large wood. The more biology is driving the system, both physically and creating nutrient availability to supply macroinvertebrates. We also think of different habitats in presence of keystone species like beaver meadows as the most biology-driven areas to places where beavers were physically removed as an indicator of less biology influence. The photo on the right is a tributary to the Hubbardton River and may not look like much when this photo was taken in spring, but you can see the influence of wood and beaver presence on the system. Biology-driven streams have the highest biodiversity, and even among this kind of murky water, we found more signs of life than the fast-moving cobbly brooks nearby. How we impact our streams can also be put into these 3 buckets. Most of our stream and riverscape restoration takes place in the geology corner in that brown triangle, where we stabilize channels with impermeable armor. Our restoration tries to move away from towards the biology side, but falls short due to project constraints and societal expectations that don't allow channels to migrate out of their set path. There's a fear that biology will take over and it might do things that we don't predict. The question we pose to you all is how far out of that corner can we go and how much control are we willing to give up? So let's walk through some examples of how we alter stream evolution. So these are both pretty common sites across Vermont, and this is how we geologically structure our streams. Our solution to flooding ag fields are ditches, and our solution to protect infrastructure is to armor the banks and keep them in their course. We laterally confine them and contain them structurally. We affect hydrology-driven systems by altering hydrology using dams and straightening and confining our rivers with hard armoring. The pictures on the right are how we have historically restored rivers by riprapping the banks to prevent erosion. And this not only confines the stream laterally, but allows water velocity to increase through these reaches, causing erosion, destruction, and water quality crises downstream. In addition, these streams provide little to no habitat for aquatic organisms, as other people mentioned in their presentations earlier. And that's really where biology-driven systems can come into play. If we return streams to biology-driven, or at least biology influence, we will have more resilient and healthy riverscapes. Riverscapes meaning not just the stream channel, but the banks, the floodplain, the vegetation, and the surrounding human communities. We can take systems that look like the one on the left, which are narrow and fast-moving with no retention of sediments or meandering, and take them to streams on the right that have biologic input through large wood and debris. And these systems support more biodiversity and provide habitat for many species. In fact, this question about what stream conditions provide the best habitat was part of a study by Clure and Thorne, and the developers of the stream evolution triangle aligned it to the Clure and Thorne stage 0 channel evolution model, the cyclical one that Shane showed earlier, to show where the different stream conditions fell within the triangle. And when they compared the stages from Clure and Thorne's paper to habitat and ecosystem benefits, they found that stages 0 and 8 had the highest biodiversity and habitat values, while all the others fell short. And the benefits of stage 0 and 8 could be a whole other talk that Shane and I would love to give, but just look at them compared to the stream evolution triangle. They're the two stages closest to that biology corner. Therefore, the biology-driven systems provide more habitat and benefits. Our job is getting into the biology corner to maximize our ecosystem and habitat benefits. And as restorationists, it's exciting that this work can be done fairly easily. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Shane to introduce a low cost and low effort way to reintroduce the biology element to your streams.
Okay, thanks, Megan. So if river floodplain connection is critical to the health of our riverscapes, including riparian ecosystems, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% of our rivers and streams are incised to extensive alteration, including the removal of all biological structure. And the science tells us that the natural reference and most ecologically robust condition is one that is dominated by biologically derived structural elements that maintain highly sinuous multiple thread channels that are well connected to their floodplain. And it seems that what we need to do is restore that biologically derived structure to our systems that are currently structurally starved. But can we really do this? Isn't stream restoration expensive in both design and implementation? Well, one important fact to keep in mind in considering that question is that first and second order streams, our headwater streams, make up 70 to 80% of most watersheds, as shown in this map of the Lamoille River developed by Mylone and McBroom. And first and second order streams, because they are small, they're well suited to inexpensive, low-tech, muscle-powered restoration activities. So there are plenty of opportunities to restore the biologically derived structure to our watersheds in an inexpensive way, if only we really knew how to do this. Well, as luck would have it, muscle-powered practices that restore biological structure to small streams have been developed by groups such as NOAA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Utah State Restoration Consortium, the Forest Service, and others. These process-based approaches are well-founded on the latest science, well-documented, inexpensive in design and implementation, and are suitable for application in Vermont. These practices aim to promote the processes of wood accumulation and beaver dam activity, creating the structural elements that reduce the efficiency of drainage, promote flooding, trap sediments, resulting in a plethora of both aquatic and terrestrial ecological benefits. Planting riparian vegetation certainly meets those criteria, but the practices of adding large wood, building beaver dams, and perhaps someday even reintroducing beaver to certain sites addresses the lack of structure in our streams on a shorter time scale. And many would argue that with the freshwater biodiversity crisis that is currently underway, we don't have time to wait. And finally, another great aspect of these low-tech process-based restoration practices is that they're perfect for volunteers and teams like BYCC. And as we all know, engaging volunteers and youth groups not only increases the cost effectiveness of our projects, but it also provides a fantastic opportunity for the broad education that must take place if we're going to ever achieve our ecosystem restoration goals. So with that, I'm going to hand the screen back to Megan, who's going to talk a bit more about low-tech process-based restoration in the context of the land use constraints that we constantly bump up against in the river restoration world.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. So where can we implement these restoration techniques? We obviously can't do them everywhere, but we've found success and seen the most potential in applying them in headwater systems. So like Shane said, headwaters make up the majority of our river miles and watershed area and pose the least constraints from infrastructure and societal pressure. So within the headwaters, there's a couple different avenues that will change what types of PBR you can do there. We have retired ag fields, which are usually lower gradient and perfect for beaver-based restoration. And then there's forested and ravine settings, which can be higher gradient and great for strategic or post-assisted wood structures. In general, we should just be identifying constraints and looking for degraded streams. Where the constraints are low, process-based restoration, or PBR, which I might continue to refer to it as, can be more effective than just planting riparian buffers, especially if the floodplain and stream are disconnected. These are places with potential for process-based work where we can let biology drive the system. So I want to acknowledge that process-based restoration is already happening in the state. Strategic wood additions or large in-stream wood additions or fish hotels, as Will mentioned earlier, are a tool used throughout Vermont, and it is PBR, but at a different scale. Fundamentally, it is reintroducing structural elements to the stream, but may require more effort. And Shane and I are suggesting that can be done at an even smaller scale. In forestry settings, we can complement timber harvest with stream restoration. We're less confined here, and PBR is compatible with surrounding land use. These logs were part of a climate-considerate timber harvest on TNC land in Greensboro, and were used on site to make in-stream wood structures. They add biology to the degrading system and are already creating pockets of habitat in this once homogeneous stream. At the same time, or same site, we used smaller pole-sized stems to create small structures. Branches packed behind the structures act as a net that collect fine particles and debris. And this can be really easy and a great way to mobilize volunteers. We had a staff day where people were burying logs into the banks and stuffing branches upstream of structures. And they had a really great time, and we got a lot of work done. Maybe, there we go. In agricultural settings, we find sites like this with really entrenched and usually straight streams just covered by reed canary grass. And these low gradient areas need to be introduced to some biological elements to get them out of the geology dominated system. And if these fields are abandoned, we don't have any constraints. And that's where beaver-based restoration can come in. This lighter imagery is from TNC's Hubbardton River Clay Plain Natural Area in West Haven, Vermont, and features 3 geomorphically different streams. So A is where beavers came in and drastically reduced the incision process in a ravine setting. You can see in the LiDAR where the widening and entrenching just stops suddenly, isn't connected to the flood, or is connected to the floodplain, my bad. B is an inset floodplain that we built in 2008 downstream of a culvert. And C, which includes the pictures from the last slide, is a hydrology and geology driven stream that is very entrenched following years of agriculture and contains no structural elements due to being completely an open reed canary grass field. The difference between A and C is startling, and all comes down to the presence of beavers creating structural diversity, slowing down the flow of water and adding the biology element. And we can replicate this in our low gradient ag streams and actually plan to apply it to Site C in the next couple of years. This project, led by VLT on VLT land in Jericho, shows an example of an incised channel in a ravine. There's a culvert at the head of the reach that's contributing to the incision, but otherwise this site wouldn't be bothered by beaver activity. PBR is compatible here because the stream won't jump out of the ravine. And ravines are natural, but far too often they incise more than natural due to human activity throughout the watershed. Shane, will you click? Oh, perfect. You can see where the current riverbed is in blue and where the ravine would be without incision in red. And we have to acknowledge that there are societal expectations and social carrying capacity for this type of work. Going back to Stream A at Hubbardton River Clay Plain, we know it's in a ravine. The top picture on the right is taken looking down from about a 20-foot bank, and yet beavers were able to restore it. This little beaver pocket is right off of 22A, but you would never know it because it's contained within the ravine. We get nervous about letting biology drive our systems, always considering constraints and infrastructure, but at the right sites, process-based restoration can mimic the beaver behavior and restore our incising streams beyond what planting alone can do. And just in conclusion, our understanding of river restoration has evolved from single thread to anastomose channels and emphasizes the importance of biology. We need that biologic input that creates roughness, slows water, connects the river to its floodplain, and supports biodiversity. And process-based restoration can scale up our restoration efforts because it's easy, cheap, and can engage folks across Vermont. We can deploy PBR at a suite of sites and do it for a really low cost. And more than that, anyone can do it. This is a great way to engage the lay person and teach about watersheds and riverscapes. And we're really excited to apply this work and share it with partners and in an attempt to restore headwaters of Vermont. And with that, I guess we will take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan and Shane. Yeah, we have plenty of time for a few questions if folks have questions for them.
I like the PBR goes well with Pabst Blue Ribbon. Actually, the logo for process-based restoration is modeled after the PBR logo.
Sounds like looks like we have a question from Erin.
Hi there, thanks, great presentation. I had a question about the beaver restoration. So are we bringing beaver back to these systems? Do you guys go and trap some beaver and drop them off at the sites?
So I'll take that, Megan, I guess. You can add if there's anything else. So Erin, good to hear your voice. It's been quite a while. Reintroduction of beavers is a big part of this process-based approach that's been pioneered out west. This all started, I think it's fair to say, in the Columbia River Basin with NOAA money for salmon habitat recovery, and it's spread into Utah and other western states. And so often the case, you know, on those large BLM lands and other federal lands where there are really no constraints, they have the opportunities to reintroduce beavers, and it's really an effective practice. And believe it or not, beavers work pretty cheap, and they work over many years. So adaptive restoration is built into the system. We have hopes of exploring that opportunity because of the low cost of it, but I think there's a tremendous amount of work to do in engaging social constraints and assessing where we might be able to reintroduce beavers. One of the things that came out of the Utah State Restoration Consortium is what they call the BRAT tool, which is a beaver restoration analysis tool. And it is it's a GIS tool that allows you to look for areas with beaver suitability, and that's something we're interested in toying with a little bit here in Vermont. So answer to your question, we haven't done it. We recognize there are major constraints. Likely here in Vermont, if we make habitat suitable, the beaver will come, but we are interested in exploring the idea. So there's a long answer to your question.
Great, thanks, Shane. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Awesome, and it looks like we got a bunch of questions in the chat. So one it says, perhaps one more question for Mike Klein, is process-based restoration being considered in the functioning floodplain initiative tools? Mike, I think you're on the call still.
If Mike chimes in, there he goes.
I'm here. Yeah, I just typed an answer into the chat. So the analysis of connectivity departure that we're trying to do is really intended to get at changes in process, and the whole prioritization of project types within the FFI is going to consider those departures in process and prioritize projects to restore process. So this is great stuff, Shane and Megan, and I look forward to you folks really guiding our hand in identifying these low-tech process-based practice types within the FFI.
Thanks, Mike. And I just want to take a moment, to mention that we are not the only ones involved in this work. We've Alaire Diamond with BLT, Bob Hyams, who's also on the call right now, have been engaging with us on this, and has have others. We have a beaver-based restoration group with, I think, several folks that are on the call now, Will Eldridge, Chris Smith, and others. So there's a growing group of folks interested, but we are never shy about spreading the word.
So we have another question from Bob Hyams, who says, is anyone doing this work in the Champlain Valley? Any creativity in sourcing wood where wood is hard to come by?
Bob, the project that the last project that I showed where we worked with a lair from VLT and Bob. Bob was really creative, and we used buckthorn stems he did some invasive control and used the stems. So that's the most creative thing I've seen, Bob. You're asking the question, but I think you know the answers. And yeah, I think that's something that we're exploring. And I know at West in open fields, they had to, they do like conifer removals and use those in stream restoration. So we could employ something like that here, maybe with our invasives.
Great, and we have another question. They're flying in the chat. This is a question specifically for you, Megan. What is the estimated time for planning and design?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing and where. I think the best projects we've done, we put a lot of thought into the design, and then it all changes when we get out there. And I've seen projects where we spent months planning where to put wood structures, and I've seen projects where we just went out and put them in as we were there. When you have an eye, kind of how Shane has, for knowing where to put them, it's a lot easier if you have someone with you who can do that. I would say the benefit of these is that they're really cheap and easy, and there shouldn't be a lot of prep work that you need to put into it, besides site selection and gathering materials and stuff like that, and the actual implementation.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that last point that Megan made. And for everyone's, I showed it, but if you didn't catch it, it's the low-tech process-based restoration manual out of Utah State River Consortium. Google that and you'll find it. And they get into a lot about the design, but really what they're trying to emphasize is that, you know, the design isn't complicated. It's not super technical. It's really a planning exercise. And that's what makes, you know, that's one of the things that makes all of this accessible and makes it inexpensive. And I should add, that's not to say, you know, the other thing we didn't talk about is, you know, we have to consider our regulatory obligations, and we have to conduct, you know, and develop designs appropriate for the permitting process. So there is that to consider, but it's much less technical of a process than a you know, more traditional river restoration type of project.
Sure. Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the chat, and then maybe you guys can address the ones in the chat or follow up with those folks later on. So this question is from Sasha. It says, exciting to think about how this approach could be used. Are you willing to do field-based trainings in Vermont?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sasha. We are. One of the things we really want to do, you know, we kind of have this vision about scaling this work up, and how you do that is by training, you know, many people to do that, right? And I have this vision of, you know, all of the locally led, watershed group led volunteer days, you know, that typically focus on buffer plantings, to maybe someday also, you know, include this arrow in their quiver, and getting groups out there to do this work, you know, large groups of volunteers. So part of that, of course, would be training, and I would love to be involved with an initiative to help train folks across the state to do this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shane and Megan. This is a really interesting presentation. And like I said, there are even more questions in the chat that you can take a look at and respond to. Now we're going to switch gears to Annalise Carrington with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in the Intervale Center, who's going to be talking about the site preparation and direct seeding work that she's been doing.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks everyone who has presented so far this morning. It's been such an interesting few hours so far. Let me get this presentation queued up. All right, is that coming through? Let me put it in presentation mode.
Yep, we can see it. Looks good.
And let me pull up my notes. Okay. All right, so like Allison said, I'm Annalise Carrington. I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. in a partnership with the Intervale Center. And this morning, I'm going to give kind of a crash course overview in the work that's being done right now in Vermont, specific to site preparation and direct seeding. So I want to give a brief overview of what we mean when we say site preparation and direct seeding, and what's been informing our work so far here in Vermont, and just describe a bit what kind of the breadth of what is going on right now by a growing number of partners in the state, and then drill down into a couple of case studies. I'll try to be as succinct as I can with those. And then transition to some lessons learned and what else we're working on this coming season. So it feels requisite to start with the classic aspirational photo montage that captures this phenomenon that practitioners have seen at many sites across the state when annual cropland, in this case corn ground, is taken out of production. So the concept is fairly simple, and in many ways replicates natural processes in floodplains or in riparian systems. So you have bare earth in the fall and into the spring, you have reduced competition, and those early pioneer species like silver maple and box elder and cottonwood are able to colonize and establish at really impressive densities. So of course, we're finding it's not quite as simple as this in practice, but our guiding questions with this work is still how can we replicate these conditions to allow for the natural recruitment or direct seeding in some cases of riparian forest species, and where possible, this would be a more cost-effective form of implementation, and it could allow for higher establishment densities than we can currently achieve through transplanting, which could help overcome site pressures like deer browse, and generally accelerate the pace of natural succession that we're seeing in these floodplain areas. And also without transplant shock from planting, we've seen seedlings grow at a pretty impressive rate in the first few growing seasons. So once we started doing some research and looking beyond Vermont and thinking about these practices, of course, we're not the first ones. There actually is a pretty large existing community of practice out there. I just provided a few examples here so there are some different technical references and implementation guides, both for different approaches and applications of site preparation, and also for direct seeding, although direct seeding is definitely more of kind of an emerging science, in most places still in the research kind of stage of things. So one of our goals beyond continuing to implement and trial on sites this year is to pull together a more comprehensive literature review or reference manual that we hope will be useful for practitioners in Vermont. So just to step back a minute and kind of in thinking about what these terms mean. So site preparation and direct seeding are, of course, complementary practices, but as has come up many times in some different sessions, site preparation does have applications beyond just preparing a seed bed for natural recruitment or direct seeding. So there are different considerations for site preparation as a pre-planting treatment to control competing vegetation on restoration sites, as opposed to creating conditions amenable to seeding. So namely in how aggressive you might need to be on a given site to achieve, say, bare earth conditions, if that's your goal for seeding. So yeah, to start with site prep, of course, various techniques, both chemical and organic, borrowing from farming practices, really. So looking at mowing, haying, plowing, tilling, herbicide, tarping. There's really a large toolkit out there, but really dependent on site-specific conditions and goals with what you end up employing. And like I mentioned, several different applications. And then direct seeding, I've really been thinking about it as a strategy when you don't have a proximate, reliable, abundant seed source for your site. And I was thinking about this during the last presentation with a lot of our floodplain systems altered at this point. It can be harder to rely on, you know, a flood event at the right time that's going to carry seed to your site. So that's just one consideration. But again, in practice and the implementation of it, we are again borrowing from farming practices often, or you know, a few other applications with seeding. And the current goal, like I mentioned, is, you know, still being in sort of the research phase of this, is really to figure out what species and what methods of direct seeding will be most reliable season after season, and really operationalized at scale. So this question, I was struggling with how to capture this in a succinct way. So there are a lot of different complementary projects going on right now around the state, and a lot of different partners that are involved in different capacities, either by you know, providing a land base where we're beginning, you know, for demonstration sites with this work, or you know, actively involved in implementation. You know, like yesterday, Ben Gabos and my colleague Katie Kane were talking about fall site prep as a pre-planting practice for CREP projects. There's some complementary research that's being funded by the Lake Champlain Basin Program through UVM. Steve Bartlett is leading that, also looking at different site preparation techniques ahead of planting. But then beyond that, other projects looking specifically at site preparation for seeding. So some of the key partners there, along with us, with the Partners Program, have been Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy. We actually got permission to do some direct seeding at a CREP project down in Whiting. So a lot going on at some different scales and some different approaches, and happy to elaborate on that more after this presentation. And again, we're kind of operating in this gray area between research and development, and also beginning to really implement some of this. So let's see. All right. So diving into a couple case studies now. So these are two projects that were both, we started implementation in 2019. They are, you know, they represent two different scales. The La Platte Headwaters Town Forest site, we're working with about 5 acres. And it's a, you know, dominated by reed canary grass. It's a former floodplain field in the northern part of the town forest. Here we were exploring direct seeding techniques. And I also mentioned that Vermont Fish and Wildlife and the Connecticut River Conservancy have been key partners here. Our approaches for site preparation were really building on work that the two of them started at a couple of WMA sites along the Barton River that they were calling the cornfield replication experiments. So then, and then Ethan Allen, small site, we were using organic practices. The vegetation is not as aggressive. We're looking at a mix of grasses and forbs. So we were playing with some different techniques here, and using the Xerces Society guidance on organic site preparation for wildflower establishment, actually, as a guide for how to create kind of those bare earth conditions in a seed bank. But we were just relying on natural recruitment there. Okay, So I'm gonna try to break this down as simply as I can. So I'm gonna start with our site preparation methods here. So we were looking at an approach using herbicide only, plow only, and then plow in addition to an herbicide treatment. So the timeline here was basically over the summer, the entire site was hayed, and we went ahead and hayed the entire site as opposed to just brush mowing it, because we wanted to remove that thatch layer, thinking that that would better facilitate direct seeding, and it also would ease getting a plow in there to not have the thatch binding up in the tines and with the rototiller. So the entire site was hayed, and then come August, we did the plow work. We used a chisel plow, 2 passes with the chisel plow, and then a rototiller. And the reason that we ended up adding the rototilling was to both further disturb the roots, but also from a kind of an implementation standpoint, to create even ground for the ATV, the boom spray work we were going to do for herbicide after the fact. So it seemed important to break up those larger furrows to allow for more consistency there. And then we let the site rebound for 4 or 5 weeks. And then we did the herbicide application on the regrowth. And I'll say, so for the plots where we just did the herbicide application, after it was hayed, it was just left until we did the herbicide application. And it was in the fall. So, well, it was the first part of October that we did that. And I'll just note with the herbicide application, not everything is going to rebound after you mow it or hay it. So that actually ended up working to our advantage here, because the reed canary, after we plowed and tilled, it sent up its secondary growth shoots, and that's what we ended up hitting with the herbicide. But other species on the site, like Joe Pyeweed, for instance, did not regrow after it was mowed down. So there are a lot of perennials and other other forbs that won't rebound after being mowed. So that could be a technique to really target reed canary grass, for instance, if you're doing a late season herbicide application. And we ended up contracting the tractor work here, and then we did the herbicide work and the seeding work in-house. And I'd be happy to answer more questions later about the specific equipment we used and kind of the process of working with contractors for that. All right, so direct seeding. This also has a lot of nuance tied into it, but we ended up using 2 methods for direct seeding. We hydroseeded with just some small seeded species, so eastern cottonwood, shrub willow, and quaking aspen, and then we just broadcasted silver maple. And yeah, this was pretty involved, because we did all of the seed collection ourselves. So it was quite a bit of seed to collect, and then process and store, and then coming up with seeding rates based on anticipated establishment rates and seed viability germination rates. And yeah, so let's see if I have this on the next slide. So we ended up seeding at the beginning of June. So after all of the site prep the year before, we seeded at the beginning of June, and then we had almost a month with no rain and really hot temperatures. So yeah, the takeaway there was that, erratic weather, unpredictable weather is going to be a challenge with this, just like it is for planting trees and shrubs. But we still learned a lot about seed collection and working with native seed, and some of the takeaways going into next season. We are going to try to hydroseed in May to try to take advantage of some of that early season moisture. So that will require storing seed. So those, the poplar species I mentioned and willow, you can actually freeze the seed. So we have seed in storage right now, and we're planning to do hydroseed again this coming May. For silver maple or other seed, other larger seed, incorporation could help protect against desiccation. We're thinking about other seeding strategies like using a seed drill potentially. We also did, I didn't mention this earlier, but we did some really small scale oak seeding, just poke hole acorn seeding, and we actually had really good establishment with the oaks. It was the only thing that really grew from our direct seeding. So again, certain species are going to be more resilient to that erratic weather. We also set up a small section for fall seeding. So we did a similar site preparation protocol this past summer. And then we seeded out several species that we collected at the end of last summer and early fall. And I see a lot of opportunity in a fall timing for seeding. Those species that are adapted to seed out in the fall would then just stratify naturally on site. And it means that you don't have to be getting out onto sites early in the spring. And those seeds could be more resilient to waiting to germinate when conditions are amenable. All right, so here, this is also kind of a lot here, but because we didn't have a lot of hard data on direct seeding, the focus of our monitoring over the summer was really on trends in percent cover and vegetation across treatment types. And there was some really interesting information that we gleaned from that that is pretty intuitive, but I wanted to just really highlight it here. So just first looking at early season monitoring. So at the beginning of June, this is right before we seeded, the herbicide only and the plow plus herbicide treatments were both really effective at reducing the cover of live vegetation. And the primary difference there was that there was substantial thatch cover in the herbicide only because it was never plowed, and substantial bare earth still by the beginning of June where we plowed and then did the herbicide application. So our thinking there is that that will really be the sweet spot for direct seeding, especially if you're just broadcast seeding, to have that bare earth in the beginning of the growing season there. And by the end of August, there was substantial live vegetation across treatment types, but there was significantly higher diversity in the herbicide only and the plow plus herbicide treatments, primarily among the forbs. And by August, there was that field that was once just dominated by reed canary grass was really some pretty impressive pollinator habitat. You had species like blue vervain and Joe pieweed and boneset and swamp milkweed that had either been lying in wait in the seed bank or in their kind of perennial rhizomes waiting for an opportunity to grow. And then the plow only treatment, I'll say, for our purposes, appeared to be the least effective. There was quite a bit of grass cover that had reinvaded the site by the beginning of June, and also substantial reed canary grass that had regrown there, whereas there was almost non-existent reed canary in the herbicide only and plow plus herbicide plots. And the last thing I'll say is, we can't gauge persistence in this first season yet, but work that's been done elsewhere seems to suggest that even 1 year of site preparation like this with herbicide can really lead to some meaningful shifts in vegetation composition on these sites that, regardless of whether or not they're paired with direct seeding, could really meaningfully accelerate restoration or natural succession on these sites. Okay, so now we're pivoting to the smaller site at the Ethan Allen Homestead. This was a much simpler design. We, like I said, we're using the Xerces Society reference to look at some different techniques for organic site preparation. So this property is managed by the Winooski Valley Park District and the New Farms for New Americans. They have a pretty large community garden, really a farm here, and they've seen some really nice natural recruitment of silver maple along the field edge there. So they were excited to partner with us to explore expanding the forest edge here. So we looked at basically tarping, the technique called soil inversion, which is basically moldboard plowing. So trying to turn the soil over to get at more of a sterile soil, and then smother cover cropping. So we moldboard plowed the entire strip here, and then we laid the tarp down on one end, and then and we used a big silage tarp, and then we used winter oats as a smother cover crop. So some of the takeaways here, lots of box elder seedlings. That's a species that is really successful at establishing from seed at these sites. One thing that we noted was that the timing of when you're exposing bare earth can really influence what species you are favoring. So we pulled the tarp in late May, and so we didn't have, that soil wasn't exposed to box elder falling in the fall. So that really favored silver maple and eastern cottonwood that were both seeding out in June. Some other cover cropping didn't do much. I wouldn't recommend that as a practice for site prep like this. We are trying shallow repeated cultivation as another means of controlling weeds and creating a seed bed at McKinsey Park, which is just upstream from the site. The vegetation was pretty dense by August, but there was an impressive amount of seedlings across this whole site, and they really did appear to be holding on even with the weeds. So I included a couple pictures of box elder and a cottonwood here that had already grown pretty substantially just in the first couple of months. And as far as organic site preparation goes, if you aren't trying to establish things from seed, just mowing or manual clearing, it would be a much easier approach than these more involved practices. But again, for our goal of trying to encourage natural recruitment, we wanted to do that additional disturbance. Okay, here's my last slide. I was trying to capture some kind of like key takeaways and lessons here. I'll start with site preparation. So just like with farming, timing is really critical, like I already alluded to. And site conditions can really impact when work can happen. So when you have access to a site, if it's if it's too wet and you can't get down to a site, that might be an issue. And then we're always thinking about how little can you get away with to achieve your goals. So we feel like removing thatch could be really important for natural recruitment or direct seeding. We couldn't prove that this year, and that is something that I think we should continue working with, because if we can get away with not getting heavy equipment down there to do plowing or tilling, That would obviously be a lot easier from an implementation standpoint. Yeah, like I mentioned, altered floodplain conditions make a difference. You always want to match your methods to the site. Disturbance and invasives, this is something I've thought a lot about for our work. It's hard to know what you're going to release when you disturb the seed bank. So for instance, at the La Platte Headwaters site, well, at that site, we actually had poison parsnip along the road. So we made a point of mowing that down before it went to seed to try to decrease the risk of it seeding into, you know, these bare sites that we had opened up. So I think their proactive risk management is important, and just, yeah, generally being mindful that you won't know what you are disturbing with the seed bank. And then we also, like I mentioned, are hoping to develop more of a reference manual around this, within the long term, ideally being able to have this inform an NRCS practice standard, for instance. And then with direct seeding, there's a lot to unpack here, but scaling up while maintaining viability is going to be critical with this. We don't yet have large seed collection capacity in the state. There aren't contractors doing it like in some other states. So that will be a challenge. And unpredictable weather, like I said, and seasonal unpredictability, that's going to continue to be a challenge here. Also, always thinking about how little can you get away with. You know, I mentioned, you know, we're thinking about incorporation as an additional aspect of direct seeding when you're broadcasting, for instance, and we don't know yet how much of an advantage that could give you, and it will vary season to season. And I do see direct seeding being fertile ground for a larger research initiative potentially, because there is a lot of science to get into here. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I left that much time for questions, but yep.
Great, perfect, Annalise. Yeah, it is noon, so like technically the session is over, but we have the room for another hour. So if folks have questions for Annalise, and Annalise, if you have a couple minutes to stay on and take them, then we can absolutely do that.
Yeah, definitely.
If people have questions, feel free to raise your hand or type them into the chat. Go ahead, Sean.
Hello, thanks, Annalise. That was great. So I guess I'm thinking about what we can do moving forward in the short term in terms of site prep, and what I'm thinking is that the direct seeding sounds like it's still sort of outside our reach, and it isn't quite, you know, probably not, you know, we don't know enough about how that works to actually start to implement that. So I'm thinking more of, you know, what we need to do as we move ahead with bare root plantings or tubulings and that sort of thing. And it sounds, you know, you mentioned this very briefly, that you think that just mowing might be enough if you're not having to direct seed, but I'm wondering if you could, oh, sorry. If you could, I've got my, all the phones ringing, the schools must be calling. So I'm just gonna wait for it to quit because I can't talk over it. Oh. Okay, so, you know, anyway, you probably understand my question that, you know, what would your recommendations be? Should we continue moving along the same path that we're on now, where we just plant, or would you suggest that we should start thinking about rototilling, mowing, something like that ahead, the fall before, if we're able to do that?
So thank you for the question. I think I think that kind of site preparation practice could be really beneficial. And I think your approach might depend on whether or not herbicide is something that you want to use on your project. I think some kind of rototilling, if you can get equipment out there in the fall, or even just mowing the site in the fall in advance of planting, that could go a long way, but that would still require you to keep up with that maintenance during the growing season. If you're using herbicide, we've seen that control can kind of hold on through the growing season a lot longer at suppressing vegetation. But like I mentioned, you might be suppressing one thing with herbicide, but you're going to have other, other weeds or other things coming in the space that you open up. So you still need to have diligence in terms of kind of maintenance and follow up with that. But that said, I think in terms of reducing competition to hopefully allow for the best growing conditions in that first season in particular for transplanted material can really go a long way.
And I just as a follow-up quick question, it sounds like maybe just mowing is maybe not as useful as actually as haying. I mean, or remove, if you can remove the.
So I was bringing that up more in the context of seeding because, so two things. Allowing or trying to have as much bare earth as possible for seeding, that would be a reason to removing thatch, but also like getting equipment through. Like if you're trying to use a rototiller or use plows and you say you've mowed down 3-4 foot tall grass, that's going to get bound up in the equipment you're trying to use. So it's just a consideration when you're thinking about about site preparation. And I know some folks have instead of haying, if you maybe mow multiple times during your growing season so that you don't have, the grass isn't as tall, and you can be breaking it up multiple times with brush mowing. But again, that also, assumes that you can get, a mower down on your site. So.
Yeah, and I suppose if you leave the material, that could maybe actually suppress, weeds coming up.
Yeah, I mean, in the concept, I see where you're going with that. I don't know if I've seen that in practice, although I do know I'm familiar at least with one site where they've used mulching as a technique, kind of similar to tarping, and they've just rolled out round bales the fall before to basically smother vegetation and then plant it into that. And I could, depending on the scale, like for a small scale site, I could see that being a good practice because also the mulching that theoretically you would have from that hay could help, retain moisture for planted trees and shrubs. I think if Katie Kane is still on, she was involved with. We were both. Katie and I helped push those hay bales last fall. Yes.
Yeah, and we don't have any results from that yet. We haven't done that.
Yeah, this is all
Annalise, I did want to ask just if you could clarify, we're talking about mowing here, but just in terms of direct seeding, I mean, just to speak to, that wasn't a standalone treatment in this work, right? And in terms of the idea of creating bare ground, I mean, that's not really accomplishing that goal, right? You might see a reduction in vegetation height the next season, but most things I would expect are going to come back if mowing is all that you're doing.
Right. Yeah. I guess I was just thinking if all you're trying to do is just keep the vegetation at bay around planted trees and shrubs. But yeah, you wouldn't see the same benefits from that in terms of encouraging natural recruitment potentially, or allowing for direct seeding. And so if you are going to go through with site preparation, you might as well do something that I think would be a little more involved, but give you more bang for your buck the following season. Because again, the timeline that we're seeing most effective with this is to focus on that prep work the season before, the summer and the fall, so that you're ready for the following spring.
Great, thanks.
It looks like there were a couple of questions for you in the chat, Annalise. One was, is periodic irrigation a practical approach in droughty summers?
So that's not something that has been tried here. I think it could be, but you'd of course have the all of the constraints that would go along with installing some kind of irrigation system or sprinkler system. I will say the inspiration for us for the hydro seeding work was with research done around the lower Colorado River basin. And they were actually tapped into the irrigation networks for the ag production there. So they were hydro seeding, but also basically like flood irrigating those larger sites after the fact, which did appear to really be necessary for them. And I think we felt here in applying those methods to Vermont, we can typically rely on some moisture spring conditions, more rainfall to support these seeds and seedlings. But again, it's sort of a question of like, how little can you get away with and still get what you want? And we're still teasing that out. And that might be kind of an elusive question, just in the sense of like, it will be variable season to season.
Great. And then there's one other question that I saw from Lenny. Are controlled burns off the table for eliminating thatch or mown reed canary grass?
Let's see. Sorry, will you repeat that?
Sure. Yeah, it's are controlled burns off the table for eliminating thatch or mown reed canary grass?
So they're not off the table, but they can be pretty onerous and involved in terms of getting approval to do them and expensive. We did look into that for the La Platte Headwaters site. And the other thing I'll add is that I've seen some references that have shown that a controlled burn can actually act to like fertilize the reed canary. So you like control it with a burn, but then it comes back even stronger than before. So our thinking with the plowing and the herbicide, for instance, is that specific to reed canary, you get that kind of 1-2 punch of breaking up the roots, and then it sends up its secondary growth, and then you hit that with herbicide. So, the former work at the Barton River sites proved that was the most effective treatment for long-term control of reed canary, and that's what we saw, at least in this first season, as well at the La Platte site.
I think that was all the questions that I saw in the chat. I don't think I missed any. There's a lot of sort of conversation happening in there as well. So I think we can wrap up this session, and thank you, Annalise.